Good evening, everybody. I'm Lionel Barber, the chairman of the Wincott Foundation, which was set up a number of years ago to promote quality business and financial journalism. And this is our first virtual event. So bear with us. It's new, but also we wanted to do something different and show that we truly get digital journalism, not just print journalism. And we also wanted to put on display as our first guest to this virtual conversation, Alan Smith, who is, I think it's fair to say, Alan, when we hired you about 5 years ago from at the FT, you were little known, but you've become the king of data journalism. And tonight, I'm privileged to be in conversation with Alan. We're going to hear about how he made some very significant changes at the FT, but also we're going to have a little bit of a seminar where Alan's going to show you some examples of what can be done and how things have changed. So thank you, Alan, for coming on the show to this conversation. And I want to start by let's go back to when you arrived in the FT newsroom. You came with an OBE from the Office of National Statistics. You had no background in journalism. What did you find, and what did you think you should do to start changing habits and practices in the newsroom?
Yeah, hi, Lionel. Thanks for having me. I mean, that's a great opening question as well, isn't it? Because when we first met, I mean, I think one of the interesting questions you had for me was, you know, why should we hire someone who hasn't got a traditional background in journalism? And I think my answer at the time was along the lines that, you know, actually the work that we've been doing at the Office for National Statistics to try and get data into the public arena, to make it part of the conversation, was actually a very similar trajectory to what we wanted at the FT. And so the very fact that career paths like that can now converge says a lot, I think, about how journalism is changing. And in fact, previously how the civil service was changing. But when I arrived at the FT, I think it was really interesting. I mean, there were a couple of things that were obviously very, very different to what I'd been used to at ONS, not least of which is the pace. Obviously, the pace of journalism is different to, let's say, a census that you run every 10 years. But actually, the really interesting thing about arriving at the FT was just a sense that this was an industry that was already in transition. You know, the FT already had its digital paywall. It already realized that the future was more online than off. And then I think there's always that game to play about how is content going to have to change to adapt to that new world. You know, you can't just take your print portfolio and put it online. And well, we had a joke about this earlier, didn't we? That some of the content that we've been producing at the FT historically, let's just say it's kind of aged a little bit. And maybe just because we do want to drop in, when you're talking about visual and data journalism, you want to look at things. Let me just share.
This parental guidance is required on this one,
yeah,
Alan. So
it is.
Please don't be offended, but this really did appear in the FT.
Yeah, this is it. So this is, I think it's probably the closest that we've ever come to a sort of, you know, maybe, you know, an indiscreet moment in the FT. But yeah, I mean, this is 1999. And I mean, this wasn't just the FT. I'm not just having a poke at the FT here. This was a trend in the news industry at this time, and heavily influenced by things that were going on in the US, actually, where publications like USA Today had popularized this sort of form of infographic. But the one key point to get across here, Lionel, is this is not data journalism, right? Like this is certainly visual and it's certainly memorable, but it's not data journalism, because what this is just decorating data. There's almost like a sense that the data itself here is boring and you need to decorate it to keep your audience attention. And well, I think that's a little bit insulting to the audience as well, right? Like, you know, we really want the audience to feel like we're giving them things that are actually going to enlighten them and educate them. And wrapping, you know, small little charts in decoration like this isn't really going to do it. So, I mean, thankfully things have moved on a little bit in the industry since then. But I think you really have to have this sense when you talk about where content is going, you've got to know where it's been coming from as well, and that change is a continual process, not just a one-off. So we've certainly moved on from that phase. And I mean, certainly the last few years at the FT, you'll be well aware that our focus has been about actually making the story about the data, not about the way that we decorate it.
So before we look at other examples, I want to hear a little bit more about how you, as a manager, helped to push through change. Because I think you, and it's one of the reasons I hired you, not just because you were an OBE, Alan. I sensed I was in the presence of a leader and somebody who could persuade people to change. So first of all, tell us a little bit more about how the FT was, the practices and what you were up against, and then how you changed those practices.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big risk that you have when you're faced with a kind of a change management challenge like that is to really think too much that this is just a digital and technology challenge, right? Like that all you need to do is just get hold of the right tools and the right software and throw it at the existing structure, and that's going to solve all of your problems. I mean, I think the challenge that we face, and lots of other organizations have faced, is this is a very human challenge, right? Like it's actually about trying to encourage people to be part of the change, whether or not they're actually the people making graphics and producing analyses, or whether there are other people in the newsroom, because there is a sense of empathy needed, right? Like, you know, you need to have some respect in both ways. And you certainly need to feel that people, because people aren't necessarily data analysts or graphics producers, that we're not saying any of those other skills that we see in the newsroom are somehow deprecated or sort of irrelevant. So, I mean, I think the thing that we've tried to do is to make it clear that everybody's still got something to bring to this party, and it's the way that we organize ourselves that's the big difference.
Yeah, and you obviously had some, and I can see one distinguished member. Hello, Martin Starber, who's national figure, brilliant in terms of understanding technology, but also around grasping the significance and importance of data. And so it was a question, I speak now, I'm prodding you a bit, Alan, but as the editor, I mean, my concern was that you, if you like, bringing you in, that this skin graft worked and that you'd be able to work with the likes of Martin established in the newsroom, and also that we were still fairly early in the process of digital journalism of the kind that Martin and his team were pursuing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually, because one of the first things that I did when I arrived in the newsroom was just to look at how, what is the workflow? How does a newsroom operate? How do stories get commissioned? How do they get edited? How do they get published? All of that is something that when you're looking at it with fresh eyes, that first 6 to 12 months is incredible. Everything is new and you're looking at it as a new arrival. I mean, the thing that I found that I think we really have pushed for change on, and it has been a notable change in the last few years, is if you have, I mean, I have a book here in the shelf, right? News Writing by Anna McCain. It's about 20 years old, I think, and it explains how the newsroom works. Now, in that book, the graphics desk is just a little kiosk that's in the corner of the newsroom that an editor goes to just before they publish a story. That's basically the workflow. All of the reporting's been done, 1,000 words of copy have been filed, and really graphics being commissioned really more for page layout and decoration, as we've seen. The big change that we have made in the last few years, I think, has been to get our data reporters and our visual journalists connected more directly to reporters rather than just to the editors. I mean, that editing connection is still incredibly important, but one of the things that's really good is, when you can introduce a visual or data journalist to a story at its conception, things are going to look very different. You know, you're going to be able to do things differently that you can't do at the last minute. The whole story can come from the data rather than just, like I say, this kind of sense of a kiosk in the corner.
So before we look at another example of change, I think I would say here, the crucial point, and Tony Major, who's the secretary of the Wincott Foundation, should take all the credit for reaching out, finding you and bringing you in. I'd love to take the credit, but it's not me. And I think one or two other people actually in the newsroom knew of you. The crucial point here is that the FT's newsroom had evolved significantly in terms of the shift from print to digital, and not to start. And this, by the way, took, I don't know, say 8-10 years to stop thinking about the newspaper first, but to really think about the web first, the digital form of our journalism, and then have the newspaper content derive from digital. And in that way, it was complementary to what you were trying to do, which was to make sure that the data visual experts got in, if you like, at the basement, at the beginning, not at the end, where you were a mere kiosk. I've never thought of you as a kiosk, actually, Alan, but, or indeed Martin or the rest, David Blatter or the others. But anyway, let's have another example of, perhaps an earlier example of where you said, because it's so important to produce examples to show what can be done.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there are a couple of things that I think are really were quite important milestones for us in the transition, and I ought to say that that transition is still happening, right? I don't want people to get the impression that we say, right, you know, we've solved that problem and there's nothing more ahead of us. You know, that this continual change is still unfolding. But I mean, one of the things I think that we did that I think was a really interesting idea, and you'll remember this, Lionel, from when we were in based in Southwark. But one of the things is I wanted to promote the conversation that we were having about visuals and graphics and the job that they were playing. And so we produced this resource in the team, something called the visual vocabulary. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a poster. It's nothing much more than a poster. It seems a bit ironic to be talking about a poster, a kind of printable thing when you're talking about digital journalism. But this was actually a very influential moment for us. We printed this out big in the newsroom and put it on the, Lionel, you would have walked past this every day into conference. We made people stand in front of it and see it. Because it was a couple of things that were really profound about this. One of them was just this use of the word vocabulary, right? Like that's incredibly important to show that there is a grammar to graphics in a very similar way to the grammar of the written word, and that those things can kind of, that's something that, you know, all journalists should be able to appreciate, but also that we start telling stories with data, not based on what something looks like, but on what the relationship is in the data that we're saying. So as a resource, just to kickstart a conversation and collaboration between people in the newsroom, that was incredibly important. One of the other things that we did, I think, that was also a relatively early marker of what we were trying to do, was a piece that we did a couple of years ago now.
Hold on, can I just stop you, Alan? Just 1 minute.
Yes, of course.
Because this visual vocabulary is so important. Do you want to just go back to it and just pick out a couple of things and say, this was significant? You can take your pick, because I think leading by example, it's so important if you are going to get change. To demonstrate, you've got to be able to demonstrate. So let's just have a very quick, before we go to the broadband, which was pick one or two of them and just talk about it.
Well, so I mean, my background, Lionel, you're right, it's not in journalism. It's not actually in statistics either. My background is in geography and digital mapping. My master's is in something called geographic information systems. So really, if you were going to say that I was anything originally, it was a cartographer. Now, that means that you kind of think that when I work on a graphics desk in the newsroom, I'm going to be happy every time someone comes over to me and says, Alan, I want a map. You know, actually, maps, for example, are such a good thing to pick on as a thing in the newsroom, because on our visual vocabulary, one of the points that we wanted to get across was, you know, when you have data that's got geography in it, so, you know, when you've got data that's got places in it and it's got cities in it, that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to translate directly onto a map. You don't have to map everything, because you can see here on the visual vocabulary, we've got a category here called Spatial, which is really about maps, right? Like, this is about maps that you could use and apply for stories in the newsroom. But the most important thing here is just this trade-off. You know, in the visual vocabulary, what we said was, use these when geographical patterns in the data are more important to the reader than anything else. Because the moment that you put something on a map, you reduce your ability to use any of these other lovely techniques for showing some of these other patterns. So what we actually did, and what we used this very successfully for, I think, was to push back against requests for maps that didn't really need to be maps. You know, maps that could be something else, that could be a much richer form of visual that focused on a different pattern in the data. So this really, for me, was when we talk about the kiosk, the first step is, let's change the question that gets asked at the kiosk. And it's not, what do you want? Because the answer would be a map. The question is, what do you want to show, right? Like, so this is the most important thing. What is the story? And then let's use that, and let's use this resource to be able to have that. The other thing that I really like about this vocabulary is it introduced both FT journalists and our readers to a much broader palette of chart types than they were used to seeing. So if you think about pie charts and bar charts and line charts, these are things that everybody learns at school, probably primary school. And yet when I say to people, well, give me another chart type, when did you learn your next one? Everybody, you know, clams up, because we have this period where people fall out of learning how to read charts and data. And so actually on this vocabulary, we've got some fairly new chart types that people hadn't seen before, like to represent what I would call absolutely core FT stories. So this flow category talks about data that shows flows of funds, flows of trade, flows of migrants. You know, that's an incredibly rich vein of journalism right there. And I'll give you an example of where that first appeared. We had a really big chat with the company's editor at the time about putting one of these complex graphics into the middle of an M&A story, right? And we were very much aware that this was going to be the first time that a lot of FT readers had seen anything like this. So if you can see the text here, we actually said, how do you read this thing, right? Like, how do you read this M&A diagram? And we explained, you know, this outer wedge here is like a pie chart. This outer wedge is just the overall, this is China's acquisitions, this is North America's acquisitions, and so on. But these connections show you, like, so the value of European acquisitions of North American companies, the value of North American acquisitions of European companies. So this is a two-way flow of M&A activity, and the color shows you who's dominant. So the relationship between North America and Europe, North America's dominant. But look at China, thin little chords here, but they're all red. China is dominant in every single one of its M&A activities. So it's a really rich chart that we want people to read at for 4 or 5 minutes and come away feeling smarter.
I think that's great. It's multi-dimensional.
It's amazing. It's the one thing where you kind of say, you know, when some people say, you know, a chart should be understood in 5 seconds. Well, some charts do, right? Absolutely. But some charts we want people to read. Now, the really interesting thing, and my whole credibility, I was prepared to swan back out of the newsroom when we published this, was to look at the reader comments. And I mean, I'll scroll back down to this because this still makes me laugh. We published this. The first reader comment on this story was, that chord diagram is horrible for presenting information. And at that point, I felt like getting my coat and walking out of the newsroom. You can see here that 5 people recommended that comment. So 5 people said, yep, thumbs up, that is a terrible diagram. But then when we saw the rest of the reader responses start to come in, something interesting happened. We had this comment here, fantastic charts. Shows effective visual representation of complex material. The chord chart gets my vote for chart of the year, recommended 24 times. Now that ratio of 24 people loving it to 5 people disliking it for me, that was a mandate that this approach was worth putting with. You know, if 5 out of every 6 of your readers appreciate it and feel they're coming out of this story smarter, that means the strategy is working. And we can't afford to hold back.
Great story. I'm so glad that you didn't take your coat. So let's move. Let's go to something which I have to say, for me, because I do remember that chart, but this next example, for me, it lit up my life, because I'd never seen anything so rich and informative, but also in digital form. It was new, it was path-breaking, it was collaborative within I think the interactive team was still in situ at that point, before we created the new sort of visual and data journalism team, which you now head. So let's talk about broadband in Britain. Alan, give us a guide.
Yeah, so actually there's a couple of things on this project, Lionel, that I think are tremendously important and really important still today, actually, which was just look at the byline in the story, which is, you know, journalists love, you know, that the byline is quite an important thing. And what I love about this byline, the byline for this story is, yes, there's people from the visual and data journalism team, but there's also the telecoms correspondent, Nick Files, right? So this is a classic example when we were talking about how do you bring things together, realizing that, you know, the domain knowledge of the beat reporter is still incredibly important in this model of journalism, right? And the best, the kind of greater than the sum of its parts journalism is going to come from this sort of collaborative model. The other thing with this story that was really interesting was just the kind of origin of it, the genesis of this story. There was, unlike, you know, the question was asked of me by our company's editor at the time. I'm curious about the state of broadband in Britain. We don't know enough about it. So without knowing really what the story was, it was just an expression of curiosity to what can we find out about what's happening in Britain today with broadband. It was a very general point. And so what we did was within my team, we went off and found a data source, a very rich data source via Ofcom that allowed us to look in incredibly fine-grained detail at broadband speeds and data usage across the UK. And that process allowed us to actually find the story. And the story was that Britain's broadband speeds are not just a simple function of urban and rural. I mean, you're more likely to have a faster connection in an urban area, but it's not always the case. And in fact, what we found was that the very, very fastest, so this chart kind of summarizes this national level. You can see here, this chart here, this axis is broadband speed, okay? So on the left here, slow, on the right, that's faster. So we found, you know, this is the rural postcodes. These are rural areas. This is the urban areas. So you can see, yes, on balance, generally urban areas are faster, but we found bits of Knightsbridge here, which were incredibly slow. And then amazingly, we found that the very fastest internet speeds in the country were, well, you know, I'm going to take you on a tour. They were actually in Cumbria. And we thought this was a problem with the data when we first found it. When we first found it, we found all of these little villages in Cumbria and northern Lancashire that were running speeds of 1,000 megabits. Okay, so that's off this chart. It's off my screen. And when we talked to Nick, the telecoms correspondent, he was like, okay, well, I'm going to go and find that. So we used the data to actually direct the reporting. And what Nick did was he went up and found that actually it wasn't a problem in the data. It wasn't an error in the data. It was a rural farming network that were laying their own fiber network across their fields, right? And so from what people kind of think that data journalism has this kind of reputation for being, you know, a bit dry and a bit inhuman, you know, but actually you get a very human story out of this. It's about the farmer's wife here that Nick interviewed said, you know, the main benefit's not really the speeds, it's the community. Most of the volunteers are over 65 and they're as fit as butcher's dogs. Their wives have fallen in love with them again because they've got their six-packs back. You know, like this amazing sort of story that we only found from looking at the data. So for us, that was great because that allowed us to pull a narrative out of this, this amazing big data set that we found. But then I think the other thing that we did, and it was brilliant because we had people like Caroline Nevitt in my team really putting in an enormous amount of effort into designing an experience for readers that would bring them into the story. And, you know, so what that meant is you could put in a postcode and it would take you and your postcode into the story. So for example, we would zoom you into your area, we'd mark on the chart how fast your area is. There was like a little Twitter card prepared that allowed us for people to tweet and share there. So this kind of visual, personal and social approach, I think it was a very good example of that. And what we ended up with, I think, is the best of both worlds here. We've got some very, very strong, well-written copy about a very human story, but that is thoroughly contextualized by the data that we use to find the story. So for me, that was quite an important point in our journey because we wouldn't have been producing a story in that way 3 or 4 years ago.
No, so let me just come in there, Alan, and the reason that I was so pleased with it was, first of all, it produced a story, but it did the most important thing, which is to challenge comfortable assumptions, conventional wisdom. You know, up in the north, there's nothing there. They're slow, and it's all cool in the cities on broadband use and broadband capacity. So all those kind of stories where you're overturning the assumptions and you're digging deeper is tremendously, they're just tremendously important, which leads me to the second point, which is personalization and what we, you know, the mantra at the FT, which is engagement, getting the readers to engage with the content, engage with the journalism on a highly personalized basis. It just ticks that box. And so it was a tremendous piece of work. Thanks. Let's maybe move to another example that you feel was good.
Well, I mean, I think let's have a look at something a little bit more recent. So, you know, obviously the story of this year has been COVID-19. And I mean, I've talked to a few people about the potential impact of COVID on journalism, because obviously in some ways it's the story of a century, but it's also a story like no other. And my view is that, you know, data has been at the heart of COVID reporting throughout the year, you know, both for the FT and for other news organizations. And I think what that really makes us think is that that experience of the last year is surely got to accelerate our sense of change here and the way that we kind of put data and data reporting at the heart of our kind of journalistic endeavors. Now, just on the theme of personalization, I mean, one of the things that was really interesting for us was as we were starting to get a grip with the crisis and the pandemic, we produced this coronavirus tracker, which is a sort of go-to resource. Couple of interesting things about this. I mean, this is now the most viewed FT webpage ever. Right? Like, so that's a product both of the story itself, but then lots of things have been published about the crisis. It's not just COVID. It's the fact that this is a one-stop shop to really get a sense of the progress of, or lack of progress at times in terms of dealing with the pandemic. Now, early on, what we were doing was producing graphics for this tracker that we updated on a daily basis to allow people to see the scale of the unfolding crisis. I think it was very effective at that from quite an early stage. But what we realized here is, I think also, this is a global crisis. So there's only a certain level of personalization that, there's only a certain level of relevance that you can give a reader just from looking at a static image like this. And so again, the team sprang into action and developed an interactive version of our sort of famous coronavirus charts. And the thing that I like about this is not only do we give the readers the chance to sort of change what they're looking at, to explore the data. So, you know, I'm interested, let's say I'm not really interested in the UK and the US. Let's see how the US is doing relative to Brazil, right? So we can allow the readers to lean forward and take charge of this and decide whether they want to look at deaths or cases, whether they're looking at cumulative deaths or just the daily kind of rolling averages. Do we want to compare just the raw numbers, or do we want to kind of standardize it using population? The great thing about this, though, is as well as allowing readers to kind of personalize it, every time you interact with this page, it changes the URL here at the top. And what does that mean? It means that my deep view of the data that I've just generated, I can share with other people. So if I send that to somebody, if I tweet it,
Brilliant.
if I send it to someone else, they're actually able to see the same view of the data that I'm seeing as well. You know, the US and Brazil compared using the deaths on the 7-day new rolling averages. So for me, this is a really important part. This is one of the things, if you look at these charts and how they've performed over Twitter, for example, they have very, very much informed the debate, because of course opinions about the crisis and how best to deal with it have been a huge part of what we've been trying to cover. So yeah, the most important thing to realize here is the ability to mouse over things and get numbers. That's great, right? Like, that's good. But the real value of this interaction is when you're personalizing it around the reader so that it means something more to them.
So I hate to interrupt, but so you must fill out some more thoughts here. But a shout out for John Byrne-Murdoch, who's done amazing stuff in terms of managing all the data in this COVID pandemic. But Annette Hester has just asked on chat, how easy was it to get reliable COVID data? I must say, I asked myself that question a lot of the time when I was watching.
Well, I mean, it's a great question, that data. I mean, we sometimes, I think one of the things I noticed in the newsroom was that you can kind of think of the data as the under the bonnet element of what we're doing here, right? Like everyone sees the graphics as the final output, but there's a real difference between data and graphics. And although they are very often co-located, they are discrete things. And I think most data journalists would agree that they spend 90% of their time trying to find and massage the data before they get to the fun bit of being able to do graphics and write stories about it. So data has been quite important. Now, the thing that we found with the tracker, which I think was really interesting, was that we needed people's help, right? Like, I mean, when we put the tracker down, one of the things that we said was, help us improve these charts. Because I mean, there was nowhere, I mean, obviously Johns Hopkins and ECDC, these were places that were trying to compile and aggregate data, but nowhere's got everything. And as we found during the crisis, as people like John Byrne-Murdoch and Martin Staber and others found, even the official agencies could be putting out misleading data or data that was prone to drastic revision. So, we had to have this real sense of QAing the data. Now, what we did was we put together a dedicated email address to ask readers to give us their insights on where there might be good data available. And we went off and looked at them. So there was a real sense that we were actually compiling data in a way that we wouldn't have done traditionally for news stories. And you're absolutely right that people like John Byrne-Murdoch have been absolutely great in this crisis, proving the concept of fast-paced data reporting, right? And that's very, very different from the other form of journalism that we've been looking at here, which is the deep dive analysis and research, the deep dive visual projects, which also have, are just as equally important. So data has been incredibly important. The crisis has really stretched us. One of the things that we did, for example, with compiling all of the data on excess deaths here, so this is like a key measure that people have been using to make international comparisons as to this measure of excess deaths, was once we'd compiled it, we open sourced it. We published it on GitHub, allowed other people to look at it. I think it spoke a lot about our kind of transparency and our goals to try and open up our journalism. And it was nice to see other news agencies take that data and do other things with it. So data has been absolutely vital to reporting, because you just simply can't do anything else without it. You know, it's been a real challenge.
Well, let me just again point up a couple of things that you've said here, which are, and I speak as someone who started in journalism back in, I almost said 1878, but actually it was 1978. The crucial point here is the FT would never have done this. I think 5-7 years ago, we didn't know about crowdsourcing. We didn't know how to do it, and partly because we would say, well, we've got our in-house experts. We've got these brilliant people, and they can do their research. So actually, and I think you should take credit for this as well as people on the visual and data side. Interactive, for example, suggests that you're actually going to, it's a two-way process. Well, I can tell you for a long time at the FT, it was a one-way process. So this is really a sea change in the way FT journalism has evolved, and also putting it up on GitHub where people can kind of look at it, pick it apart. That again is very, very new, and I think a sign of confidence, but also humility.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, and also I think what it helps do, Lionel, is it helps demystify some of this. Because yes. I think there's been a perception generally that, you know, all data exists and all you have to do is go and find it. You know, all you have to do is just kind of, it's there, you just need to get it, load it in and make your chart. I think as much as anything else, this crisis has been great for showing that actually there's a real art to being able to get hold, to find reliable data sources that you can harness. And, you know, I think the thing that's been great here as well is it's just showed the value in having a sort of slightly two-pronged strategy here, because John Byrne-Murdoch's been doing great work throughout the crisis with the fast-paced data reporting. But when we look at a page like this tracker here, that's no longer really a story. I mean, it is a story, but it's a product, right? Like it's a product that requires maintenance and curation and a kind of a level of resourcing that you don't associate with the story that might be fish and chips news wrap by the end of the week, right? Like this thing has already been alive for 7 or 8 months. And for us, that's been a real learning curve. How do you make and maintain products? It takes time, it takes resource. And I think the thing that we found is you get smarter by doing it. If you went to the team now and said, what have you learned now compared to where we were in March in how to deploy this sort of story? There's been a massive learning curve here for everyone.
Indeed.
In the team. They've risen to the challenge brilliantly. But one of the things that, like I say, this part of this point that I think the crisis is accelerating our thinking because it's stretching us to do things that we, like you say, we haven't done before.
So we won't name names here, but there was somebody who spoke to you recently who said, I didn't go into journalism to study spreadsheets. You can comment on that if you want, Alan, later. But Paul Amory has come up with a good question, listening into this conversation, saying, what resources or courses would you recommend to how to learn some of this, these skills, which you can bring to the newsroom? Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. Thanks for asking it, because I think it speaks to a couple of things, and I will go back to that point, Lionel, that you raised earlier. But just in general, where can you look? Well, I mean, if you're already a journalist and you want to develop some skills in this area, there are definitely some places to look that will offer you introductory courses that assume they don't assume that you're a statistics expert or a programming wizard. I would be pointing people to things like the Knight Center, who do some great MOOCs on data journalism, introductory MOOCs, and people like Alberto Cairo and Simon Rogers and Scott Murray have been involved in setting courses up for the Knight Center, which are really first-rate entry point courses. And I'd recommend them. Lots of other journalism courses obviously available, but you know, there are now introductory courses that try and, I mean, as much as teach people the technical skills, teach the philosophy of what this is trying to accomplish and how it might complement your existing skill sets as a reporter or editor. The other thing that I'd point out is I think also we're starting to see now, I mean, when we talk about the skills of a data journalist, we're really talking about a huge overlap with the field of data science. And so the more you dig into it, the more you realize that there's just these real parallels with the curricula that you're seeing now for things like data science programs in postgrad universities. So in addition to things like computational journalism, data science programs are now generating people with skill sets that would be immensely valuable in the newsroom. And so there's loads of places to look. And the thing that I like about it is that it's bringing people together. The point, I have to go back to the point about spreadsheets, right? Like, I mean, that was one of my slight shock things when I first arrived at the FT. I originally thought, you know, spreadsheet literacy is going to be great at the FT because this is a financial news organization. And it's true, there are some people who are absolutely great with spreadsheets at the FT, right? Like I've got a long list of people like that, people who are and when I say spreadsheet skills, what I mean is people who are confident handling data, right? That's what we're talking about. But I've also encountered quite a few people who aren't. And in fact, if we extend it more broadly, I have, even in the last few weeks, Martin Stauber pointed me to a Twitter thread where effectively people were, you know, saying almost as a badge of honor, I can't bloody operate a spreadsheet. I can't do maths. I didn't do journalism for that. I mean, I don't think many people would get far in the world of journalism historically if they said, I can't write for toffee, right? My grammar skills are terrible. No one says that in an interview and thinks that they're going to be hired. And I think if you're working for a financial news organization, it shouldn't be a badge of honor that you can go in and say, I don't know how to use a spreadsheet. I shouldn't be expected to use a spreadsheet or understand numbers, right? Like, I think there are probably a lot of journalists who are looking at this year of COVID and thinking, actually, you know what, it would have been great if I knew a little bit more about spreadsheets because it would have given me another angle in my reporting. So I hope, when I talked about two-way respect earlier, didn't I? You know, that it's about mutual appreciation. I want data journalists and visual journalists to still appreciate really well written sweeping copy, you know, like that great written story. You know, we don't want to deprecate or lessen those skills, but we need it both ways, and we need people to understand that some of these skills, we're not saying it just so that we can kind of pacify the nerds in the corner, but these are essential skills for journalism.
Yeah, and I think it was one of the things I was most proud of, frankly. I mean, obviously the big scoops and the investigations, but the way in which data, visual journalism moved kind of center stage. There was another example of where David Blood in the data team helped one of our journalists essentially show that the election in Congo had been stolen. And he did it by working through dozens and dozens of spreadsheets. Similarly, Dan McCrum would never have been able to break open fully the Wirecard story had he not been able to grasp spreadsheets. And the other bigger point, I think, Alan, is that we know about the bloviation, the opinions, everybody's got an opinion, but actually this shows that facts matter.
Yeah.
That was the lesson of Wirecard. It's also the lesson of COVID.
Yeah.
Facts really do matter. And if you're on top of the data, and you've also got technical skills, then you're going to bring something extra to the party. So there is a bit of a convergence, I think, in modern journalism between, if you like, the software engineers and the wordsmiths.
Yeah,
you have to be multi-skilled.
I think that's right. And I mean, my favorite recent example of that, you know, and this is very biased because it's another example from my team, Lionel, but, you know, this story that we published a few weeks ago here, you're absolutely right. I mean, so much has been written about COVID. And one of the things we'd like to think about our work at the FT, obviously, I mean, just in general, is that people see us as a trusted news source. You know, that the news and our analysis of the news is something that they can rely on and learn from and come away enlightened. And there's so much that's been published about COVID. It's almost like you can't see the forest for the trees. So with this story from our team, a very great ensemble team effort, it starts very differently to a normal FT story. We've got a kind of a sort of visual teaser here, but we bring people through this whole crazy year looking at paradoxes and insights of the data that we've gained from all of the months that we've spent studying and reporting on this crisis. The one thing I'll say about this piece was it was entirely produced within the visual and data journalism team. So this is actually very different indeed. So we wrote the copy. Crucially, the thing that was different here was we wrote the copy around the graphics, right? Like there's a thing that didn't happen a few years ago. We're using interactivity in a way that allows people to see the unfolding story chapter by chapter, right? And talking about, you know, the micro stories within COVID, you know, how in the US did Democratic governors and Republican governors differ in their responses to lockdown? How did the panic, how did the crisis spread across the US? You know, what about emerging economies? What was different there that didn't work, you know, in Latin America compared to Europe? This was, for me, a really great piece of work to be involved within, partly because my team are so talented that the output was, you know, there was a real sense of collective pride that we'd done something that readers would end up appreciating. But the one thing about this was that obviously it was successful. I think readers loved it. It was a lot of engagement around the story, a lot of people tweeting the graphics, but crucially also people sharing the paragraphs as well. Like the written word in this was still important. So you're absolutely right. You know, making sense of the craziness of COVID has been a real challenge. But, you know, again, one of those things I think that's really helped build us as a team, and I think is a great example of the direction that we can take visual and data journalism in a way that readers will love. You know, I mean, I think it's been a real eye-opener, that particular piece.
Well, before we start to close off, Alan, let me just say that at Wincott Foundation, we have decided that we will be creating a new data journalism award to add to our other long-standing awards, provincial journalism, business journalism award, the senior journalism award. We have also broadcast TV, radio, but I think we feel we want to put data journalism center stage. So that's why we've got a young journalist, business journalist award as well. So we're going to add that, and we'll be tweeting and publicizing that in coming days. Let me just close off, Alan, by saying, where do you think you will be in 3 years' time in terms of the journalist output? And where do you want to be? And I'm picking up what you said earlier about essentially COVID and what's happened and the change in working practices being, you know, turbocharging the internet, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, crystal balling is obviously, you know, well, everyone wants to know what's around the corner, particularly now. I mean, my view really is that, you know, we are going to continue to evolve this function at the FT. You know, we think, you know, I think sometimes when you're in the day-to-day mechanics of producing all of the graphics, analyses and stories that we have in the last year, that, you know, you sometimes need to step back and look at the big picture. What's happening here? We're producing stories that we wouldn't have produced a few years ago. We think they're stories that readers love, that we have evidence that they generate engagement, they're good for our business model, so why wouldn't you do more of that, right? Like that's just a no-brainer, right? Do more of it. How do you do more of that? You do it by being smarter in the way that you commission. You allow people with smart ideas to take those ideas, you know, and to kind of foment those ideas so that you know, one of the things I want is a good data journalism story should pitch as well as any other story, right? Like it should hold up, it should stand up. You know, we want to make sure that we're not backwards and coming forwards with story ideas. I think, you know, at the moment, my team, my desk It's not a conventional desk. You know, it's no longer the kiosk quite in the way that it used to be, but it's not a conventional desk either. It doesn't commission its own stories necessarily all of the time. So that, I hope, will change in the years to come as we just provide more and more evidence of the value of recognizing the opportunities that data can offer the FT. So we think a little bit more structural change yet in the newsroom, you know, just continuing this model of change, iterating, you know, nothing necessarily revolutionary other than focusing on the things that you've done that are good and doing more of it, and trying to flush out a little bit more of the inertia that still, you know, in an organization like the FT, you know, you can't flick that switch and get rid of it overnight. Some of it is valuable corporate history. You know, you need to be very careful the way that you treat change. But when I look at it, we produced 32,000 graphics in the last 2 years. So I'm not worried that we don't produce enough. And I worry that it might be too much, right? Like, so quantity against quality, that might be something for us to really consider.
Good.
You know, so plenty yet on the road ahead, I think.
Okay, Alan, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you. I think it's been inspiring as well as practically useful. That's what we want at the Wincott Foundation. Inspirational journalism, but some practical lessons. And I would like to close by saying that this is only the first of a number of webinars and teachings and conversations that we intend to be holding, not just during the COVID era, but in the post-COVID age. Thank you again for joining us, and do keep in touch. Thank you.
Thank you.